Okay, well, let's get started. What we want to do is continue talking about gross domestic product and other measures that are similar. If you'll remember, and I won't take much time with this, but we started off the other day with this circular flow model. What side did I put the households on? It seems like the households were here and the firms were here, or business sector. Okay, then, well, okay. You could have just, like turned the paper over and looked at it from the back. Here's the firms, or businesses, or whatever, and here's the households. And the households send resources to the firms. They are paid by the firms with their dollars. Okay, then the households spend some of that money to buy goods and services. And then what we did, we said, this is sort of a general model of the economy rather than trying to capture every little detail about what's going on. These dollars going out we call spending. Over here when they come into the firm we call them revenues. And I don't think I used exactly these same labels the other day, but you don't need to go back and change your notes. If you don't have anything there, you're welcome to change. But I'm just trying to illustrate these ideas again. And then the firms pay for resources. They see these as costs, but then the households see this as income. And the point I was making to you, or one of the points the other day, is that, if we want to measure macroeconomic activity, how much business activity is taking place in the economy, we can measure that several places. And we'll talk about some exceptions to this rule later on. But in general terms, the amount of dollars going around this thing is pretty much the same no matter where you catch it. And so if we want to measure all of the income people have, that would kind of tell us, hey, how much macroeconomic activity is there in the United States? But if we also wanted to measure all the spending that takes place, that would measure how much macroeconomic activity is there. Okay? And we could go over here and do the same thing. What we were doing last time is we were talking about measuring gross domestic product. And we said there's two approaches. I've highlighted those two right here. And the one approach, which is what we were talking about last time, is where we measure all the spending in the United States, and that would be gross domestic product. And the other approach we'll come back to later, where we measure all the income. But anyway, the first one, first way to measure GDP, expenditure approach. And then we had categories of spending, personal, consumption expenditures, we had three categories, durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Those are just broad categories of what consumers spend their money on, their income. Okay? You remember durable goods are sort of big ticket items, long life. Non-durable goods are things that get consumed just on a daily basis, and I gave a couple examples, food and fuel, but there are others, like a pair of socks or the newspaper that you read this morning and so forth. But anyway, non-durable goods. And then services are, of course, there's nothing tangible handed over. Both of these things are called manufacturing, because there's a tangible product that's produced usually in some kind of a factory. But anyway, with services, what's happened is a person provides services of some type. And it could be entertainment services, it could be a haircut, there's lots of different services, and I won't go into all that. And then I came through last time and put some numbers up there, which I won't duplicate this time just because you already have those in your notes, but showing you approximately the breakdown of all consumption spending and then how it breaks down in each one of these categories. I think I mentioned last time, and I'll just take 1 second here and do it again, is that durable goods manufacturing very often takes place in big cities. And so big cities have an economic cycle up and down due to the fact that spending on durable goods goes up and down, up and down. You remember I told you that you can postpone your spending on durable goods If you need a new refrigerator set and yet you don't feel optimistic about the future, you think, you know, if I bought a new refrigerator, then I wouldn't be able to make the payments on that refrigerator if I lose my job, and maybe I will lose my job. So if you're feeling kind of pessimistic, you just say, I'll postpone the spending. I won't buy a new refrigerator. Same thing with the car and so forth. So we can postpone that, and that kind of ability to postpone spending on durables, that's what gives it the big cycle. Smaller cities and even out in the country more involved in non-durable goods production. Production of services takes place more or less every place, but some places more than others. Springfield, for example, is a big service provider. Springfield is, I don't know how far away you'd have to go from Springfield, maybe about 150 miles or so, but maybe that's not exactly right, but 100, 150 miles from Springfield, this is the biggest city within that 100 or 150 mile radius. And so what happens is if somebody wants to go to college and they don't want to go too far from home, there's a decent chance they'll come to Springfield to go to college. And if not at SMS, then maybe at Drury, and if not at Drury, then maybe one of the other schools here in town. Well, educational services is what they're buying. So what I'm saying is the mere fact that we're sort of a big town here for our region, our corner of the state, that's telling us that we'll be a service provider for that region. Another type of service that we provide here in Springfield, healthcare services. You may or may not sort of keep up with the trends here, but what's happened in the last 20 years in healthcare services is that hospitals in small towns have been closing up or at least contracting, getting smaller. And when people have serious illnesses, then they get shipped into bigger towns where they have sort of big hospitals and lots of doctors and so forth. And so like if, let's say you're living in West Plains and you need a heart operation, they don't just take you down to the West Plains Hospital and do that heart operation. Probably they'll send you to Springfield. And you could go someplace else, but the point is a lot of people would come to Springfield for that operation. So we're a big healthcare center for our region. And there's other types of services too. Let's say that a grocery store in, you know, and you can kind of think of these little towns surrounding Springfield, but 50 miles away or whatever. Let's say a grocery store needs to order some groceries. You know, the grocery store itself has got to order groceries from somebody. Where do they order those? And the answer is from a wholesaler. And the wholesaler is located where? Good chance it'll be in Springfield. So what I'm saying is things get manufactured, whether it's clothes or food or whatever, and they get sent to wholesalers in Springfield, and then what happens is the retailers for 50 or 100 miles in a circle around Springfield, they'll call up and say, hey, send us out, you know, a truckload of canned goods, or send us out some clothes, or send us out this or that. Industrial supplies too. We have a lot of wholesaling services in Springfield for business supplies. So those are services, these wholesaling services, because nothing gets produced by the wholesaler. What happens is the wholesaler buys something, he's got a big warehouse and stores the stuff in the warehouse. That's a service, storage services. When the order comes in, pick it up, put it on a truck. That's a service, moving it around, and then take the truck and drive it to that town, that small town 50 miles away or whatever, and unload it. That's a service, transportation services. Springfield does a lot of that. Entertainment services, you know, if you want to go to a concert or kind of a night out on the town or whatever, and you're living in a small town, what do? Jump in the car, drive to Springfield. Or maybe jump in a car and drive to Branson. But the point, you know, and there's other places you can go, and I don't mean to say that you can't have a good time in a small town, but I just mean that if you're in a small town, you're pretty sure that there's not like some big concert coming to town. You know, if you got 9,000 people living in your town, they don't have big concerts there. Why not? Well, because the answer is they'd have like 200 people show up. They come to a bigger town, and then if you're living in a small town, you drive to the bigger town and go see the concert. And of course, people in Springfield drive to St. Louis or Kansas City or Tulsa or someplace like that to see things that don't come to Springfield. I don't mean this is the center of the universe, but the point is that for quite a distance around here, we're the place to come. And so we provide a lot of services. Springfield has a big service economy. Much more so than the rest of the state, more so than Kansas City or St. Louis. And I don't mean to say our service economy is bigger than St. Louis or Kansas City. I mean, as a percent of our total economy, our service economy is bigger than St. Louis or Kansas City or the state of Missouri in general. Now, here's the deal. These two things, non-durable goods and services, do not go through those cycles. They sort of experience that slow growth. And if there's a recession, it just kind of flattens out. It didn't really take a nosedive. And so when there is a recession, a national recession come along, St. Louis or Kansas City will go through these cycles, but not Springfield. Springfield, during a national recession, Springfield will feel a slowdown. We were growing slowly, and now it just stops growing. And then the economy takes off again, and we experience the growth. But it's gradual, it's mild, moderate. Kansas City and St. Louis go through those cycles much more. And you can see it if you look at unemployment rates and things like that. Our unemployment rate doesn't go up much, it doesn't go down much. It does go up and down quite a bit in the larger cities. So anyway, we talked about that last time. The second category of expenditures, gross private domestic investment. Gross, you know what that means, or I guess you do. There's been no, well, we won't talk about the gross right now, but it includes, gross investment includes, what? It includes some investment that takes place just to replace worn out goods. That is to say, if there's depreciation, we have to replace those, and so that's why we say gross. Anyway, private, this is investment by the private sector, not by the government, which is the public sector. Domestic, I think we know what that means. That's investment within the United States. And then investment is what we're really talking about. And investment means, what? Purchases, no, I shouldn't say purchases, but how about accumulation of capital goods. Take 1 second and think about that. I know that you're capable of understanding it, but this thing right here is this term investment. It's another one of those terms that's used different ways. Many people, when they say investment, they mean, oh, I'm buying stocks and bonds. I'm investing. I'm putting money in that a savings account or whatever. I do not mean that. That's not what we're talking about here. Investment, we mean in a very specific way. We mean investment in as a accumulation, usually a purchase of capital goods. And capital goods, if you remember, that's one of those resources or factors of production that businesses use goods to produce other goods. Okay, and what I mean by accumulation of capital goods, like if, let's say, a company built a new building. The building itself is a capital good, and it's the accumulation of capital goods that constitutes investment. Or if a company bought a dump truck or a delivery truck or a new computer, okay, computer system. You remember, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship are our factors of production, and I'm saying the third of those, capital, is what we're talking about here. Investments, new capital purchased or acquired. You could produce it for yourself, but whether you produce it for yourself or you purchase it, capital goods or accumulation of capital goods is taking place, and we call that investment. Now, there's two kinds of investment. One is fixed investment. And the other is changes in inventories. Now, fixed investment, what are we talking about? We're talking about structures, buildings, tools, equipment, etc. I won't go ahead and list anything else, but you get the idea. Structures, I've already mentioned this to you, but I don't want you to forget that I did. Last time I said, you know, when we were talking about consumption expenditures, I said if somebody builds a home, we don't include that home in consumption expenditures. I said we call that investment. If a building, or if a company has a new building built, a new factory or a warehouse, we would call that fixed investment a structure. But also, if you had a new home built, we would call that a fixed investment, structures. The way we do this, the way we pretend, and this is not, it depends on, you know, how you look at it, but it's not the way you normally think of it, but what we pretend is this. If you build a house that in a sense you're a landlord and you have invested in housing, a landlord, you've got a business now, you've invested in housing, and then you will rent that house to yourself every month. And just each month's rent, we would call that consumption spending, but we're sort of treating you like two people, a landlord, a business person, as well as a consumer. Okay. Now, why do we do that? And the answer is, when you built that house, you knew that you weren't going to use it up in the current period. You knew that it was going to be there for years, and you know that even 10 or 20 years later, you move away, it's still going to have a lot of value, and you're going to sell it to somebody else. This is more like a business investment than it is, buying a house. It's more like a business investment than it is like just spending the money and it's gone. So anyway, that's where we put the housing. Changes in inventories. That S is not very good, is it? Changes in inventories. All we're talking about here is when a company produces something and doesn't sell it. Right? If something gets produced, let's say something is produced this year, a new car gets produced this year, and it doesn't get sold. And of course, millions of cars get produced every year, but let's say out of the millions of cars that are produced every year, this year one of those cars does not get sold, then what would happen is the inventories of car makers would go up. Produced but not sold. And we count that produced but not sold, we count that in gross domestic product. Why? And the answer is because it was produced. And what we're trying to do is get a measure of economic activity, how much production is taking place. And what we had here is goods and services. When that firm produces that good, we're going to let on like that goes in gross domestic product this year, whenever it gets produced. And if the company holds on to it for a while and sells it next year, we'll just say, well, the year before when the car got produced, it was built, it went into gross domestic product. And what category? Inventories. And so that's the way, and you may or may not agree with some of these. And the same thing for me, I didn't make this stuff up. But the point is that we have to have rules. You know this if you've ever taken an accounting class. We have to have rules that decide, or that determine, does something go in this category or that category? We need to keep things straight. And that's how we keep this straight is if a good gets produced and does not get sold in the current year, then what we say is, in a sense, the company sold it to itself. The company produced the good and then held on to it. And now it'll sell it next year. Next year, it will not, when it gets sold, we do not include that in gross domestic product. It was already included once. Okay, let me tell you, the good news is that used to be businesses were poor at managing their inventories. And now, relatively poor compared to today. Today, they do a good job of managing inventories. Used to be what would happen is this. Companies would just manufacture stuff. They'd just say something like, okay, what are we going to do this year? Let's manufacture, and we'll stay with the car story, let's manufacture 100,000 cars at our company. And they'd say that on, gosh, I don't know, January 1st. Let's manufacture 100,000 cars this year. And they say, okay. And then they'd just start producing cars. And that was the end of the story. There was no more talk. The rest of the year, they just spent manufacturing cars. Now, if, let's say on May 30th, the economy goes into a recession, then the people who are running that car company, they already decided we're going to produce 100,000 cars this year. And so if, let's say May 30th, maybe there's no recession even, maybe spending just slows down a little bit. People just say, oh, the cars are so ugly, and they get poor gas mileage, and I got other things to spend my money on. And let's just say May 30th, people slow down their purchases of cars, and, like cut their purchases by 50%. And that goes on for a while. The car makers had already decided we're going to produce 100,000 cars. So they produce 100,000 cars that year. And maybe out of that 100,000, only 60 or 70,000 get sold. And now at the end of the year, the car company, the managers, they look around and they go, wow, we produced 100,000, we sold 70,000, we got 30,000 cars. What are we going to do with it? And they were surprised at the end of the year. And so at the end of the year, they say, we got 30,000 cars. I'll tell you what, let's do. Send the workers home for 3 months. And the workers go home for 3 months, and we'll sell off the inventory. And so the workers go home for 3 months. Uh-oh, now the workers are unemployed. And since they're not working, maybe they don't get paid. Depends on the relationship between the workers and the company. But maybe they don't get paid. For sure, even if they're getting paid, and they're getting paid less, and for sure, when they're getting paid less, they're thinking, I better be careful and not spend much of this money because I don't know when they're going to call me back, maybe never. And so there wasn't very good planning at the first of the year. We produced too many cars, more than we could sell. Now we send the workers home, they're on layoff, and now they stop spending quite so much. And then other businesses start saying, wow, those Car workers aren't buying groceries, they're not buying clothes and so forth. And so then the grocery stores, they say, well, man, you know, let's don't go overboard on ordering in supplies here, you know, from the wholesalers. And so anyway, the point is there's a ripple effect that works its way through the economy. And before you know it, maybe we've got a recession now. It started off as consumers just said, you know, I'm not so wild about these cars, I think I'm going to buy fewer. And so all of a sudden now we've got a recession. Here's what happens today. They start the year off and they say, yeah, I think we're going to produce about 100,000 cars this year, but let's wait and see. What we'll do is we'll just think about January for now. And then they'll start producing, and if they get a little bit ahead in January, and let's say sales would turn down just a little bit, well, they haven't got 30,000 inventory buildup now. Maybe they got 1,000 or 2,000. And so what they say is, hey, send the workers home tomorrow 2 hours early. We'll do that this next week, 2 hours early each day. The inventories will be worked off within a week or two. No big deal. Nobody got laid off. They got sent home a couple hours early. Give them a chance to, you know, go to a dentist appointment or do a little bit of shopping or something. No big crisis. Nobody was told don't come to work tomorrow. What I'm saying to you today is there's better management of inventories, better planning. It's not just the inventory management, but it's the planning at the start of the year. What's happening nowadays is some companies are hooking up their system of production and so forth. They're hooking up their systems of production to their customers' use of the product or consumption of the product. And the only time they start producing more of the good is when the consumers start consuming more. And how do you know when the consumer consumes more? The computer comes in and tells you immediately. So, quick information, good information about consumption leads back to good decisions about manufacturing. And that being the case, we don't have a big inventory buildup. And if there's no big inventory buildup, there's no need to send people home. And if there's no need to send people home, then maybe we don't have this recession. What I'm telling you is this, is if you go back and look at the past, when inventories had started increasing, that was a sign recession's on the way. And that would be, a lot of people would talk about an inventory recession. And what they would mean by that is inventories are building up, they're getting out of hand, and you know eventually the manufacturers will have to work those inventories off, work them off, sell out of the inventory and stop manufacturing. And when they stop the manufacturing, that's when they send the workers home, that's when the recession starts. So an inventory recession we used to have, not so much anymore. Inventories are much better managed. We don't let them get out of hand. They're more like on a steady stream, or you know, kept at a steady level. And so inventories are kept under control. We don't have recessions so often. This is good news about the economy. Number 3, let me tell you a little bit about that. Gross private domestic investment. I put some numbers up here before, so let me put up a couple numbers here. Gross private domestic investment. Did I do this in billions last time? $1,270 billion. This is $1.3 trillion. Okay, and what do we have here is, man, there's a bunch of numbers here. I don't really see, doesn't break it down. I don't even see the inventory changes at all. Let's add these up. I can't add them up. This number is small, changes in inventories. That number is small, and it always has been, relative to the total. And changes, it might be $40 billion or something like that. It's a pretty small number, and I just made up the 40 billion, but the point is, it's a small number. But even though it's a small number, it had a powerful impact on the economy in the way I just described. If there's $40 billion growth in inventories, that means there's a lot of manufacturers out there that say, oh man, we got to work these inventories off. And so that would be the kind of thing that would trigger a recession. Most all of this gross private domestic investment would be the fixed investment. It does break down somewhat. Here's what it says. It's residential investment, $315 billion. Residential, and now I'm just talking about this general category here. Residential investment, $315 billion. And that's homes. Structures, those are business structures. $200 billion, and I'm rounding off to the nearest few billion. And then what does it say here? Producers' durable equipment. That's these other thing here. Producers' durable equipment. It's durable. It's got a long life. And that number was, producers' durable, $370 billion. Tools, etc. What did I say? I said $770 billion. That's most of it, isn't it? Hey, that's all of it and then some. Anyway, don't add those numbers up exactly because I'm just sort of rounding off. But it does go to illustrate that this is what, it's more than that. Something's got to be made smaller to have all that work. Well, not necessarily. The changes in inventories, you know, that can be a negative number, right? Suppose that business has started the year off with inventories of, let's say, $50 billion inventories. They start the year. That's a small number. Well, let's say $50 billion. Then what happens is they might, in that year, not produce enough to satisfy all the customers, and so then they would sell out of inventories, and maybe inventories go down from, they started at 50 and go down to 30. And if they do that, at the end of the year, inventories are only 30, that means that changes in inventories would be a negative 20. You'd start at 50, go to 30, negative 20, it's gone down. So we could have this fixed investment be positive and that negative, and that's the only way this could all work out. But don't memorize those numbers anyway. I'm just trying to give you some idea of the dimension or the general magnitudes that we're talking about. The third category of expenditures, and that's what we're doing, is we're talking about the expenditure approach to measuring gross domestic product. The third measure is government purchases of goods and services. Government purchases of goods and services. Maybe point out to you here what it does say and what it doesn't say. It says government purchases. It does not say government spending. Now you might think, oh, what's the big difference? And the answer is, there is a difference. Government spending would be everything that the government sort of spends. Money coming away from out of the government. Well, the government spends some money where it's not buying anything. Of course, we know about that, like if the government would send you a Social Security check, and of course you're kind of young for that, but if the government were to send out a Social Security check, then the government is spending money, but it's not buying anything. And so we're really focusing on where the government goes out and buys goods and services. It's actually handing over money for something in return. And those other things are called transfer payments, and we'll talk about that just in a moment. This includes government purchases of goods and services. This includes government consumption. And it also includes government investment in capital goods. Now, these two categories are just like what we've talked about for households and businesses. Households have consumption spending, businesses have investment. Well, I'm saying the government can do the same thing. The government consumes certain things, and other things the government's making investments. If the government, let's say, has a highway built, interstate highway, that would be the government purchasing something, cement, for example. The government's purchasing something, and what it's doing is it's purchasing a capital good, a highway. On the other hand, plenty of government offices, they use paper. I know they do in my office, but they use paper. So in this particular case, the government spends money to buy paper, so it's a purchase of goods and services, goods, but the paper itself is used up and gone well before the year's over. That would be government consumption spending. And we don't include that up in these categories of consumption, but I'm just saying you can think of this as two different types of government spending. For the most part, government spending is consumption, or I'm saying government purchases. For the most part, that's consumption. For the most part, the government does not invest in capital goods, but does some of that. Okay, and the thing I just mentioned a moment ago does not include transfer payments. Transfer payments are just unilateral payments made to somebody. Unilateral, the government's handing money over, gets nothing back. Una means one. Lateral means, I don't know what that means. Anyway, the government's handing money over to somebody and doesn't say, give me something back. In the case of government spending on consumption goods and government spending on capital goods, the government hands money over and something is handed back in return. Government has lots of transfer payments. And I mean, it's not like a little piece of government. It may be, and I'm talking about now the federal government or the national government in Washington, it may be the case that their transfer payments are bigger than their purchases of goods and services. This number, the $1,300 billion. That includes, and maybe I'll write this down here, includes federal, state, and local. Good. Out of all this spending, or these purchases by government, you can see that about 2/3 of those purchases are by state and local governments. So state and local governments are a lot bigger than the national government, the federal government, in terms of purchasing goods and services. What do state and local governments purchase? Highways, schools. I mean, they are the ones that are building this stuff that we see most of the time. Now, the federal government is purchasing about $450 billion worth of goods and services a year. And out of this 450, I don't know if I have this, but yes, I do. Out of the 450, $300 billion worth, more or less, is for defense. You know, airplanes and bombs and fuel and so forth. And also hiring people. But so the government, the federal government, is spending about 1/3 of what all governments spend to purchase goods and services. And then out of the federal government share, 2/3 of that goes to defense. And so I'm saying for highways and everything else that the government spends is about $150 billion other. How much does the government spend altogether? I'm sorry, how much does the federal government spend? And I don't mean to say purchases, but I mean all federal government spending is about 1.7 trillion, let me not write it down in trillions, but in billions, 1,700 billion. Here's federal spending, about 1,700 billion, and then I'm saying that purchases about $450 billion. This is purchases. My math right? Yeah. So federal transfer payments are 3 times practically as big as federal government purchases of goods and services. Now, I don't know if there's so many numbers up there that sort of got you confused or whatever, but let me walk through this again. I'm telling you this, our state and local governments spend a lot of money to purchase goods and services. That's the state and local governments. And they're spending, like the school down the street, the grade school down the street, the sewers in town, the water towers that are in town that the city government owns, streets around town. Out north of town, you know, they got this lake where they store all the water, and they build like big pipes coming into there to bring the water into Springfield so we can drink it and so forth. And that would go in. State and local spending for goods and services, purchases of goods and services, is huge compared to the federal. And then that federal purchases of goods and services is really small compared to total spending by the federal government. And the reason for that is most of what the federal government does is move money around. Most of what the federal government does would be tax some people and give it to other people as a transfer payment. And I don't know the latest number, but I'll tell you that out of this $1250, maybe $350 billion is Social Security payments, payments to retired people. And then, of course, there are federal retirees, people that have a federal pension, and there are people who receive unemployment compensation, various forms of public assistance, and so forth. And so anyway, what I'm saying to you is, for the most part, state and local governments, when they spend money, they're buying something, and for the most part, when the federal government spends money, is not buying anything. And I'm not saying this is good, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm trying to inform you about the way the federal government's business is run is it's mainly moving money around from one place to another. Some of the people who receive, and it's not people, some of the recipients of transfer payments are other governments. Like the government of Washington will take money and maybe give some of it to the state of Missouri. Maybe give some of it to the city of Springfield. And what for? And the answer is, well, they might say to the city of Springfield, if you'll start up a certain kind of a program in your schools there in Springfield, then we will subsidize you. And then they might send in $1 million or something like that. So anyway, transfer payments don't just go to individuals. Some of them also go to other levels of government, lower levels of government. The federal government is mainly in the business of moving money from hand to hand. So when we come back to here and say government purchases of goods and services, do not think about transfer payment because they're just not included. Let me see if I can get my... This is a pretty simple picture, but I don't know how this is going to happen. If you've got government over here, what I'm saying is these transfer payments, oh, I better bring it in like this. The transfer payments come into the households as a form of income. Not income, you know, this other income that we were talking about came from firms in return for resources. But in this particular case, there's money coming from the government into the household sector, not in return for resources. And then what will happen is when the household spends that money, it's coming out here as spending, then we'll capture that spending and put it in gross domestic product when the household spends it. So we don't want to count it here when it's coming in as a transfer and then count it again when the household spends it, just one time. The fourth category, we erase. The fourth category, net exports. Equals exports minus imports. And these are measured in dollars. And by the way, this is exports of goods and services. Exports minus imports. And the net, we're netting the one out against the other. These are gross exports minus imports equals the net. I suppose most people are familiar with these terms, but anyway, just to make it clear, if we manufacture something here in the United States, or if we produce some services here in the United States and provide that to foreigners, we call that an export. We've exported the goods or exported the services, and then dollars come back in return. And so those dollars coming back from the foreigners, that constitutes an injection into that circular flow. The dollars weren't here a moment ago, and all of a sudden, where would that come from? Foreigners buy goods and services. That shows up to firms as a revenue. So here's the foreigners out here. And the foreigners, they start sending revenues into our business firms, that is to say dollars, for the goods and services. Goods and services go back not to the household sector in this case, but the goods and services go to the foreigners. So this is an injection of dollars into our circular flow and will stimulate the economy. Imports, we subtract those out. Now this picture is just getting so messy up here, I'm not sure if I can use it much more. One more try. With imports, something like this happens. The household sector says, yeah, we're going to spend money, but we're not going to spend it with these people. We're going to send our spending over here to the, well, over there's where the foreigners are, but these are different foreigners. Foreign producers. We'll send our dollars there, and then they'll send us back goods and services. So, for example, if you buy a Toyota that was manufactured in Japan, the Toyota comes from Japan to the United States. There's the goods coming to the household sector, and then the household sector sends money, not directly, of course, you don't mail it to Japan, but you're sending money to Japan. That's a leakage from our circular flow. Dollars are leaving this flow, and they're going overseas. Here's what we're not talking about. We are not talking about foreigners or doing business with foreigners, buying stocks and bonds and things like that. Those are financial investments. Or if some foreigner says, I'm going to put money in a bank in the United States, that's a financial transaction. We are now not talking about financial transactions at all, only the goods and services. Okay? Only the goods and services are involved in this circular flow diagram. What, the goods and services are going this direction, and then the money is going in the opposite direction. So anyway, we are only talking about the spending by foreigners for goods and services. A couple of big exports that we have. A big export that we have is food. We've got a big surplus of food production in the United States. We produce far more than we can consume. I can't remember these numbers, but it's something like the average farmer grows enough food to feed 125 people or something like this. Okay? So anyway, we export more than enough food for the United States, so where does it go? It goes overseas. In the last few years, some of the Asian economies have been weak, and the Asian economies bought a lot of our food exports, and so when the Asian economies are weak, they can't afford to buy our food, and so, and by the way, we've already talked about that in another way, if you remember, if food's a normal good and income goes down for foreigners, then foreigners' income goes down, so they buy less of all normal goods. Their demand shifts to the left, if you'll remember that discussion. So anyway, our exports of food have been kind of soft or kind of weak in the last few years. Another big export, airplanes. We produce and sell a lot of airplanes overseas, and probably some small ones, but I'm mainly thinking about big airplanes, like Boeing makes all these big planes, and you know, going all the way from, I don't know, their smallest one, like the 737, and then they sell the 747 and 57 and 67, and I don't even know all those numbers, but I know there's a 7 on it. Anyway, those are two of our big exports. You know what else we export quite a bit of? It's not number 1 or number 2, but it's up there on the list of maybe top 10. Big export, higher education. A lot of foreigners come to the United States to study and get a college degree. And we count not only what they pay in tuition, not only is that an export, but when the foreigner comes and sits in the classroom, then they are also probably living here in Springfield, paying rent, eating food and so forth. And the rent and the food, that's all an export. And so higher education is a big export of the United States. Imports, what do we import a lot of? A couple of things that come to mind, clothing and cars. Clothing, we buy a lot of clothing from China, and there are some other places, but a lot from China. And cars, we buy a lot of cars from Japan and Germany. But those are a couple big imports. We also buy a lot of cars from Canada, a little bit closer to home here. How much are net exports? Well, let's see if we can find this. No, don't tell me that's not here. Well, I see exports, but it's stated as a percentage change. Okay, then I'm just going to have to make something up. No, I won't make it up. I mean, I kind of know these numbers anyway. I do have to do a little multiplication, though, just a second. These two things added together, exports plus imports, those two things added together add up to about $2 trillion. Oh, let me write it again in billions. 2,000 billion. And I think that this is more like about 100, I don't know, I'm not even going to try to write that down how much. I think that the imports are greater than exports. And by the way, I'm going to confuse you here. I do not mean to say that our net exports are 2,000 billion. I do not mean to say that. I mean, these two things, if we added them together, we're netting them out one against the other here in this formula. And the net might be minus $200 billion. And again, I don't have that number here in the survey of current business, so I'm not telling you that's exact, but about $200 billion, and that's a negative, saying that our exports are actually smaller than our imports. The negative thing there that we're subtracting the imports, that's a bigger thing by a couple $100 billion a year, so this is negative. So really what we do when we get GDP is we've got 1, 2, 3 positive numbers, and then we got a negative number that subtracts from it. And what I was telling you about the 2,000 billion, what I was working with is this. Total amount of foreign trade, both exports and imports added together, are about 1/4 as big as gross domestic product. And that's just a ballpark number. And so these numbers, we're talking, and if I had to guess, I would guess that we've got something like $1,200 billion, 1.2 trillion, and then maybe 800. No, that won't quite work, will it? Maybe 900 and 1,100. There we go. And those are just ballpark numbers, but you get the idea. If we export $900 billion worth of goods and services, import $1,100 billion, then we're $200 billion in the hole. Our net imports, or net exports, are minus $200 billion, and yet the two of them add up to about 1/4 of GDP. And the reason I'm telling you this is, boy, that 1/4 of GDP is kind of a big number. A lot of people in the United States are involved in either exporting or importing, and a lot more of us in consuming our imports. Any questions about this? Let me take just one more minute and then we'll stop. What we're going to do next time is this. There's two approaches to measuring GDP. The first one, DEP, is the expenditure approach, and we've just finished that. The other is called the income approach. And what we will do for the income approach is we will come back and talk about and measure these dollars. All the dollars coming into businesses, or to households in the form of income, which would be like wages and rent and interest and profits, all that income received by households, that will add up to find the income approach to GDP. See you next time.